All right. Welcome, everyone. It's noon, and so we're going to get started with today's presentation. Just again, to remind you, if you have questions, to enter them into the Q&A box or the chat box. Those buttons should be at the bottom of your screen. Today's presentation, of course, is by Annie Claude, who's an extension educator in the state of Minnesota working with fruit crops, and we're very fortunate to have Annie join us and who can focus on vineyard practices. The workshop that was presented last week and this one are both going to be available online for viewing later, if you want to share with family and friends who you think might be interested in this topic. And we're also using times like this where we present webinars to record the content so we can provide that in an online course that Annie and I are developing that will be made available to viticulturalists across the region with a grant that we have funding from the NC SARE partnership program. So Annie's going to, like I said, talk for about 45 minutes on her seminar entitled Developing a Vineyard Weed Management Plan, and I will hand it off to her.
Thanks. All right. Thanks, Matt. I'm gonna shut off my video so you guys don't have to see my face the whole time. Can you still see the screen, Matt? All right. Okay, so today, last week, we were talking about developing a spray program in general, and today we're going to hone in on weeds. We talk a lot about diseases and insects. They're extremely important, but I feel like a topic that might have been overshadowed a little bit is weed management in the vineyard. Not something we talk about a ton, but it's still important. So this vineyard on the home screen here is of a vineyard in southeast Minnesota. As you can see, he's got really thorough weed management in those herbicide strips for his new vines, and that helps those new vines grow quickly without having to compete with other weeds. So what we're going to talk about today, we're going to start by answering the question, well, do weeds really matter in vineyards, and how much? Why do we care about managing weeds so much? It's a really good question. And then non-chemical weed management tactics, that'll be the second topic we talk about. I wanted to talk about that before we actually get into the herbicide part of this webinar, where we'll be spending a lot of our time. Just because it is important to think about, weeds aren't the only way that we can manage weeds. Herbicides are not the only way that we can manage weeds. There are other tactics that can help us be more sustainable and save money on herbicides, and so we should consider those as well. Of course, a disclaimer, I'm going to be mentioning some trade names of commercial products in here, and those are not endorsements. They are just being used as examples, and the label is the law. So the label on whatever pesticide you're applying is the law. So that's the final word on that. So what is a weed first? And there are multiple definitions of a weed. One definition that is used a lot is a plant out of place and not intentionally sown. So this doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad or doing any harm. It's just not meant to be there. Similarly, another definition is a plant growing where it is not wanted, a plant whose virtues have not been discovered. That might be my favorite. And then the last definition, which is more agricultural, plants that are competitive, persistent, or interfere negatively with human activity. So this last definition sort of implies that they are doing something that we do not want them to do. They're in a place we don't want them to be. But the point here is that just because a weed is present, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's doing something that is harmful to our agricultural goals. My background with weeds and why I care about this topic. So, I grew up on a vineyard, but my master's thesis at Penn State had to do with studying the effects of undervine cover crops on root competition and how that affected the health and the vigor of the grapevines. So this relates to weeds in a couple ways. First, cover crops are one major way that we can control weeds in vineyards, especially if we're trying not to use herbicides. The second reason that this relates to weeds is cover crops can also kind of mimic the effect of weeds if they start competing directly with the vines. So after my master's, I went and worked at Penn State Extension for a couple of years, and I was one of the weeds I was studying was Palmer amaranth and other herbicide-resistant weeds like that. And so one of the things that we were doing was monitoring these herbicide resistant weeds throughout the state, but also I was spending a lot of time researching and doing extension on alternative weed management tactics such as cover crops so we can reduce our reliance on herbicides. So I think this is a really interesting question of how much do weeds actually matter in vineyards? You know, intuitively we think, all right, this is a crop. We need to make sure that we're managing weeds like we do in crops. And in some cases that is true, but in some other cases it might not be as true. And so in this picture to the left, you can see there are really neat herbicide strips. It's a beautiful vineyard. The picture in the middle is a vineyard where they're not using herbicide in the rows, they're just mowing the grass in the rows. So they're just maintaining natural vegetation. And those vines are still doing well. It's a very vigorous site. The picture on the right is from a study that was done at Cornell University where they just let the natural vegetation grow underneath the vines. They didn't mow it and they wanted to see what impact that had on vine health and vine vigor. And in that particular study, they found that it really didn't have that much of an impact. But this could have had a lot to do with their individual site. So how weeds interfere with vine growth is that they compete with the vines for resources that are underneath the ground specifically. So we're talking about competing for water, competing for nutrients, and competing for space in the soil. So if you have a vineyard where the soil is limited in nutrients, maybe you have a sandier soil where it's limited in water, then maybe weeds are making a big impact on your vines. They're going to be competing more. But if you have a site that's really high vigor and where your vines are very, very vigorous, you have a ton of nutrients, then it's possible that those weeds are not competing as much with your vines. So your site really has a lot to do with how important it is for you to manage weeds in your vineyard. So this illustration on the right is something that I used in my master's defense presentation. It's illustrating how vines respond to weed roots or to cover crop roots. What happens is vines usually put most of their roots in the top 8 inches of the soil. But when you have a weed, a cover crop, or some other plant underneath the vine, how the vine responds to that is it moves most of its root density further down in the soil. It doesn't like to take up the same space as weed roots. It will just avoid that space and go forage for nutrients and water somewhere else. So if you have soil that has a deep water table, you have enough water, deep soil, so you have enough nutrients further down, it might not make that much of a difference if you have some weeds. But if you have soil that's limited in that, maybe a really shallow soil where it gets rocky quickly, those weeds are going to have a larger impact. So how do we know that vines react this way to weed competition? Well, we've taken a lot of soil cores and we've dug about 6 feet down in the soil and analyzed where those roots are in the soil profile. And we know that a lot of them are in the shallow soil. And we know that when cover crops or weeds are present, they start fishing deeper in the soil and avoid the weeds that way. We also dug a lot of pits, not just me, but other researchers who have researched this topic, physical pits, and then stood in those pits and looked at where the roots are and how they react to weeds in the vineyard. So there's been a lot of work that's gone into this and understanding how grapevines respond to weeds. But even if you have a vineyard where the soil is very vigorous, the soil has plenty of water and nutrients, and maybe weed competition isn't going to impact the vigor of your vines, there's another factor we still have to think about in vineyards, which is aesthetics. How many wineries are there in Minnesota or in the Midwest that have a lot of weddings? Quite a few, right? And so a lot of wedding photographers, they're looking for spaces where the vineyards are beautiful, where there aren't a lot of weeds and where things look very neat and pretty. And so from an economic standpoint, it can actually be really important to have good weed management, even though it might not be important for vine physiology in some cases. Here are a few arguments for going easy on weeds in mature vineyards though. The first one is if you have vines that are way, way too vigorous and you're having to hedge all the time, having some weed competition can help control excess vine vigor, but you can also achieve this with cover crops, which we'll get to later. Going easy on weeds can, of course, help you reduce herbicide use and save costs on herbicide application. Having some plant matter underneath the vine row can also help control erosion. If your herbicide strip underneath the vines is always completely clean and we get heavy rain, maybe you're on a hill, there is a risk that erosion can occur. So having a little bit of plant cover is not necessarily a bad thing. They also contribute organic matter to the soil, and sometimes weeds can be what I like to call ugly but harmless. This weed to the right, apparently it's called a sedum. This is a very short, dense weed. It hardly has a root system at all. It's just sitting right on top of the soil. It's ugly, but it's not really doing anything to compete with the vines. However, weed management is especially important for new vines. New vines like this that are in their planting year or the year after, they do not compete very well with weeds at all. They have very small root systems, and so it's really important that those little root systems get plenty of access to nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and plenty of water so that they can grow big and tall in their first couple of years. So in these two cases, these are good examples of vineyards that are controlling their weeds and allowing those young vines to grow. Grow tubes are an important tool that we can use for safe herbicide sprays. So a lot of the herbicides that are labeled and effective in vineyards can also severely harm or kill young grapevines. So that's one of the big reasons we put on grow tubes in the summer, is so that we can spray around those vines without hurting them. And then if you do put grow tubes on so that you can do your weed management, don't forget to actually do your weed control, because otherwise you've just spent a lot of time and money putting on those grow tubes and you still have a lot of weeds around your vines. So that is a scenario that you want to avoid. Was there a question, Matt?
No.
Okay. I'm going to get into non-chemical weed management first before we get into the chemical parts of this. So non-chemical weed management tactics, these are things that can be integrated with your herbicide program in order to reduce reliance on herbicides. But I know that a lot of vineyards in Minnesota are trying to be as organic as possible, and they would go organic if it were possible for vineyards in the Midwest. And if you're trying to go organic, incorporating some non-chemical weed management is one of the easiest ways that we can do that in vineyards. It's extremely difficult to control diseases organically, but weeds are kind of that low-hanging fruit where you can be organic that way and still have a successful vineyard. So here are a few different non-chemical weed management strategies that vineyards in our area use or have tried to use. The first one would be what we call biological control, and otherwise using livestock like ducks or sheep to eat the weeds in the vineyard. The next one is mowing. This one's really common. The third one is using undervine cover crops. So this is typically a perennial cover crop, like a perennial grass, like fescue, maybe some perennial clover underneath the vine rows, not just in between the rows. Another idea is using landscape fabric or mulch. This is not usually practical for a large vineyard, because can you imagine, maybe a 5-10 acre vineyard trying to put landscape fabric down that entire thing? That would be a lot of work. But if you are trying to grow an organic vineyard, you still need to control weeds on those young vines. So landscape fabric or mulch can be a strategy there. And cultivation is the last weed management tactic that I know is being used in Minnesota right now. Here's a picture of sheep that are grazing at Sovereign Estate Winery in Waconia. So Sovereign decided to do this pilot program this past season where they paired up with a sheep farmer and they grazed some sheep in their vineyard. And so they did rotational grazing here, where they had temporary electric fences where they can put them around one section of the vineyard, let them graze there for a few days, and then put them in another section of the vineyard. They just tried it out with a few sheep this year, but they're considering a larger flock in the future, because the larger the flock you have, the more intensely they're going to be grazing on that grass. Those muzzles that you see them wearing, those are just white retractable muzzles, and so the sheep can actually easily push those up, and then they can feed on the grass, but those muzzles prevent them from actually feeding on the leaves or the fruit of the vines. Mowing under the rows is another option that I mentioned before. I'm seeing this a lot from vineyards that want to avoid or minimize their herbicide application in order to save costs and to be more environmentally sustainable. I really like the idea of mowing under rows. I know this isn't an option that's going to work for everybody, but if you're considering it, this is something that keeps the rows looking really neat, but they're not exactly bare. So this is adding organic matter to the soil. It's reducing erosion because you don't have that free soil that can run away with the rain. You are creating some vine competition. So if you don't have a high vigor site, this might be an issue. But if you have a high vigor vineyard with lots of nutrients and water, this might be a better choice for you. It can be more time intensive than spraying an herbicide, but it's also less hazardous and messy. So that's one of the things that can attract some people to using mowing as a main strategy. Perennial undervine cover crops. I mentioned this is what I was studying for my master's project. What we found in the particular vineyard, and you can see it over to the left, the row on the left has an undervine cover crop of creeping red fescue. The row to the right has herbicide strips conventionally. What we found in this case was when the cover crop was first planted, maybe the first couple years after it was planted, it maybe caused some decrease in vigor on the vines, which was actually the goal in this project because the vines were too vigorous. But after a few years, the vines tended to just adapt to the presence of the cover crops, and they grew as normal despite there being a cover crop here. If you want to use a cover crop for weed management, you're looking for something that grows really densely, so it shades out or outcompetes any weeds that are trying to come up. But in a vineyard, you're also looking for a short cover crop, something like a creeping fescue, bluegrass, white clover, something that's not going to get over about 12 inches tall. You can also potentially use natural vegetation for this if it fits those criteria. I won't be going into detail on this today. I could give a whole other webinar on undervine cover crops. So for organic vineyards, then the question is, well, how do you manage weeds for your baby vines? If you're not using herbicides, you don't really want to plant a cover crop with baby vines because that cover crop is really going to outcompete the vines and limit their vigor quite a lot. So what else are you going to use? Well, mulch then is basically the most common option in that case. So if you're planting new vines in an organic vineyard, you could put down 10-year landscape fabric. You could also use plastic mulch. You could use straw or grass mulch as well, or wood mulch, just something to cover up that soil around the vines so that they're not directly competing with weeds if you're not going to be using herbicides. I think there are a few questions.
Yeah. Do you want to repeat them or do you want me to just say them out loud?
Can you say them out loud?
So there was one question about the sheep, which I want to go to first, and it was, do the sheep eat the suckers?
Yes, sheep can eat suckers off of vines. They're really good at eating weed plants.
And then looks like Jameson asked a question about the use of cardboard milk cartons instead of grow tubes. And Lisa Smiley commented that those are used and they're typically actually meant for vineyard production. I've seen them myself in California, that they maybe only have one season based on the rainfalls that we get during our growing season. So they'd have to come off or maybe would just disintegrate before then.
Okay, thanks. Good advice.
And then I'll try to catch up on the others.
Okay. Maybe after the next slide, we'll get to another couple questions. Undervine cultivation is another topic that I want to touch on. So this is another non-chemical weed management strategy. The growers who I know who are using it are not using it as their only weed management strategy. They're using it in integration with an herbicide. So they might be applying an herbicide in the spring to get their season off to a clean start, but then maybe they're cultivating once or twice throughout the season as well. So that's what we call integrated weed management. You're using more than one tactic to manage your weeds. Now, a lot of people in Minnesota at least know that I'm not somebody who really advocates for undervine cultivation. There are a couple of reasons for this. The main reason is that I know that vine roots grow mainly in the top 8 inches of the soil. So if you're cultivating underneath your vines, you are killing a lot of those vine roots, and that's just the reality of the matter. And so especially if you're on a moderate or low vigor site, or maybe your fertility plan isn't all that it should be, it would be really risky to cultivate underneath your vines. And I actually have seen instances where that has drastically decreased the vigor and the health of the vines after a couple years of cultivation. And so if you're thinking about using cultivation, such as a weed badger underneath the vines, just do your research and be really, really careful about that, and maybe not make that investment, or maybe borrow one from a friend if you really want to try it. But, you know, I'd be extremely cautious with this. So the other reason why undervine cultivation can be risky is erosion, especially if you're on any sort of a slope. Having that free soil just sitting there, it can erode away and your nutrients are going with it. So just my main advice here is I'd really caution against cultivating young vines or vines that aren't extremely high in vigor. However, I do know, you know, On the other side of it, I do know one grower in Minnesota who does have good luck with undervine cultivation. He's been doing it a long time, and he has a good understanding of how it's affecting the vines on his particular site.
So Annie, I'm just going to jump in. There was one other question that asked, do wineries pay more for organic grapes in Minnesota? And I don't think we have any data on that at all. It'd be interesting to ask that question. And to be honest, I don't know which vineyards are producing strictly organic, certified organic grapes. And then just one more comment is that Nick said that he tried an organic herbicide that was called Home Plate and didn't have all that much success, but also commented that if you're going to try organic production, non-herbicide weed management is a must.
Yeah, absolutely. I would totally agree with that. I like all the ideas that people are contributing. So if anybody has an idea, feel free to enter it into the chat box at any point. That's great. All right, so I am going to get to the point of the presentation where we're talking about developing an herbicide plan. I'm going to go through pre-emergent and post-emergent herbicides, what those are, how they're best used, and then I'll talk about the differences between weed management in new and established vineyards, deciding what and when to spray, and then avoiding herbicide resistance as well. So we'll practice actually using resources to put together an herbicide plan, sort of like we did last week with the spray program. Pre-emergent herbicides, for anyone who is not familiar or needs to brush up on this. The pictures on the right are just two examples. Again, not an endorsement, just two examples of a couple of pre-emergent herbicides that we use pretty commonly here in the Midwest. What pre-emergent herbicides do is they work by stopping new weeds from coming up. So they're actually active in the soil and they're killing the weed seeds when they try to germinate. These have residual activity, meaning that the chemical remains active in the soil for several weeks, anywhere usually between about 2 weeks and 6 weeks, depending on the product. So if you're trying to reduce the number of times you're going out and spraying herbicide, you're trying to be more sustainable by reducing herbicide application in general, it's really important to consider using pre-emergent herbicides. They're going to minimize your need to spray later and spray often throughout the season. A couple management considerations. They're most effective when applied to bare ground. It doesn't need to be completely bare, but try to minimize the amount of other weeds and grasses covering the soil when you apply these. So you might actually need to apply a post-emergent herbicide first to clear the ground before you apply your pre-emergent herbicide. Pre's cannot kill weeds that are already growing. That's what a post-emergent herbicide is, and they can be combined in applications with post-emergent herbicides. It depends on the product, and the label will tell you which products it can and cannot be applied with.
Annie, I'm just going to jump in and comment that this is a good place to remind people to read the label. So some of these products cannot be used on vines that are in fruit production. And so remember to look at post-harvest intervals and just be mindful of the age of your plant that these are being used on. In particular, I think Surfland can be used on vines that are not producing. And if memory serves me right, you're not supposed to use that product in particular if you're expecting to have a harvest off of that crop.
Yep. I'll get into that more later too. When to apply pre-emergent. So I mentioned on the last slide, bare ground. So in this picture to the right, he had sprayed a post-emergent earlier in the season in order to clear his herbicide strips so that he can then go in and apply a pre-emergent. But if all of those dead grasses were actually alive, that would be too much ground cover to apply a pre-emergent because it's not going to get to the ground. It needs to actually contact that soil. So you might need to apply a post first to clean up any emerged weeds before you do your pre. It's a good idea to apply a pre-emergent once in the spring. About May is a good time frame for that, maybe around bud swell, bud break. And we're basing that on when weeds start to emerge from the ground. Not as much on the growth stage of the vine, but it's meant to target weeds when they're just before they start coming up or when you're just starting to see weeds coming up in the vineyard. So if it has residual activity between about 3 to 6 weeks, then you're going to want to think about doing a second spray if needed mid-season or maybe late June, depending on the product and depending on when you start seeing weeds coming up again. Post-emergent herbicides, on the other hand, these kill weeds that are actively growing. So For a lot of growers, they're more commonly using post-emergence, but I'm really encouraging people to take advantage of that pre-emergent too. It's going to make your life a lot easier. But post-emergent herbicides, they kill weeds that are growing. Most have no residual activity at all unless you're buying something that has a pre-emergent mixed into it already. So that means they're not going to prevent any new weeds from emerging. They can be combined with pre-emergence depending on the product. So as Matt said, read the label. That's the law that will tell you what you can and cannot combine it with. So if pre-emergents aren't used, that means you're probably, if you want complete weed control, if that's your goal, you're going to be using more post applications. This is going to cause you probably to spend more money, and it's a less sustainable method as well. One question.
So there was a question about, do pre-emergent herbicides, does their use develop resistance if you're to use them for a number of years in a row?
Yes. Almost all of these products, weeds can develop resistance against them. I am going to get into that in a few slides, so thank you for bringing that up. It's important to keep in mind that resistance can happen if we're just using the same one over and over again. There are some differences to keep in mind with post-emergent herbicides. The first is the time that they take to control weeds. So there are some herbicides that we call burn down herbicides, and the idea of these is that they're broad spectrum and that they're going to relatively quickly kill a lot of the weeds in the vineyard or in the field. An example of this is glyphosate, also called Roundup. Some products act a lot more slowly. For example, if you've ever sprayed quinclorac on your lawn for crabgrass, it can take maybe 2 to 3 weeks to act, or at least to show symptoms to us. And so that just has to do with what pathway within the plant that it's targeting and how it's actually attacking the physiology of the plant. So that's something to consider, and there, I'll show you where you can find a lot of that information too. The activity differs depending on the product. Some products are meant for grasses, some are meant for broadleaves, some have broad spectrum and can kill both grasses and broadleaf plants. Some are active on perennial weeds, but a lot of them are not active on perennial weeds at all. So it's important to know what type of weed your herbicide is actually effective on. And then they differ in risk as well. So gramoxone, for instance, that's a restricted use herbicide. You have to get, pesticide safety certification. I don't remember the name of the certification, but I'll talk about it in a couple slides. You have to be certified to apply restricted use pesticides, including gramoxone. There have been a lot of unfortunate cases where people have died from gramoxone poisoning. So know the risks of the herbicides that you are applying, and you can read the Midwest Fruit Pest Management Guide for details on each product, and that talks about the restrictions of each product as well. When to apply post-emergent herbicides. So I have a Coke can here, and the reason I have a Coke can is we have something called the pop can rule in weed management. At the legal labeled rates, a lot of these herbicides are most effective on weeds that are less than about 6 to 12 inches tall. A really great example of this is pigweed. Palmer amaranth you might have heard about. It's a type of pigweed. Pigweeds grow super fast, and they're really resilient against herbicides when they're about 6 to 8 inches tall and above that. So for a lot of our weeds, it's important to try to spray them when they're less than 6 inches tall. So you can take a pop can out to the vineyard with you, set it on the ground next to your weeds. If your weeds are approaching 6 inches tall, it's time to start thinking about spraying. Here's some examples of pre-emergent and post-emergent products that are labeled for vineyards. This is out of the Growing Grapes in Minnesota guide on page 100. If you don't have this guide, you can download it for free online. It's a really great resource to have for a lot of reasons. But this table is really nice. It's just a quick summary of our options. So you can see next to a lot of these products, they have parentheses. Let's take Chateau, for instance, on the left. It says 2-year AP. AP stands for after planting. So Chateau cannot be sprayed until 2 years after planting. However, if we look at Treflan, it doesn't have anything like that next to it, so it does not have a restriction like that. You can use it soon after planting. PHI, of course, stands for pre-harvest interval, so that's another thing to think about. Certain products can't be sprayed within a certain time frame before you harvest. So the Growing Grapes in Minnesota guide doesn't give a whole lot of detail on each specific herbicide, but it gives helpful tables that summarize them. But if you want a lot of detail about each product, I recommend going to the Midwest Fruit Pest Management Guide. This is just a screenshot out of one page of that book. You can see they list products like Gramoxone, Mission, Post, Rely is a very common one that we use. And then they give a lot of important details about using these products that we might not know unless you go and look it up. So it's important to research the products. That guide is a good way to do it. Also reading the product label, which you can find online for any product. And you can also contact your chemical sales rep, and they have a lot of knowledge about these products as well. Deciding when and what to spray. So let's talk about that. There are a lot of important questions that we should be asking ourselves when deciding what to spray and deciding when to spray for weeds. The first question, which Matt alluded to earlier, is how old are the vines? If the vines are less than about 2 years old, we're really restricted in some of the products that we can or cannot spray. What weeds are present and which products are effective on the weeds present, that should be impacting what we spray. What's the cost of the product? Maybe you don't need to be buying the most expensive product you can find. Maybe a cheaper one would do the job as well. And then is there a lot of herbicide resistance against the product that you're thinking about spraying? Secondly, when to spray. What's the wind speed? How tall are the weeds? Is it too late? Are they 3 feet tall already? In which case it's not going to be sustainable or effective to be spraying at that point. Will I be harvesting soon? Need to think about the pre-harvest interval. And is this a pre or a post-emergent herbicide? Because that'll impact the time of season you should think about spraying them. So the first question, let's talk about that one first. How old are the vines? For new vines, but not only new vines, but also new trunks or suckers that you're trying to train up, weed management is really critical because especially with those brand new vines, they don't compete very well with weeds that are coming up. They don't have big root systems yet. So we use grow tubes in order to spray safely around those vines. As I said earlier, there are also application restrictions for young vines. However, in some cases, not all, but some, those application restrictions can also apply to new suckers that you're training up. And the reason for that is because certain products can really damage green tissue. And so it might not be a legal restriction, but it might be a matter of that product can really kill your vine if you're spraying it on green tissue, so you need to be careful not to do that. So again, this is that table I showed before, but we're just zooming in on those planting restrictions. So you can refer to this table in Growing Grapes in Minnesota if you're trying to figure out what to spray on new vines or vines that you're about to train back up. Maybe they died over the winter, which we see a lot of. So just refer to this table and then you'll know what your planting restrictions are. Okay, for established vines, like we talked about before, in most vineyards, weed competition is less critical than it is on brand new vines. The exception might be if you're on a very sandy site. So you have the opportunity here to integrate non-chemical weed management methods as described above to increase sustainability, reduce your reliance on herbicides. So one general guideline might be you can spray a pre-emergent in the spring, maybe spray a post-emergent if needed, if you already have a lot of weeds that that are covering the ground and prohibiting that pre-emergent from getting to the ground where it needs to be. And then you might consider doing another application mid-season if needed, based on the weeds that are coming up in the field. And then think about doing a post-emergent application in the fall as well. Certain weeds are called winter annual weeds. These start coming up in the fall, and they overwinter, and then they continue growing in the spring. Mare's tail is one example of this, which we have in western Minnesota. So you might need to spray in the fall to get some of those weeds and get a jump on your spring. The second question to consider is what weeds are present. So certain herbicides only act on broadleafs, certain herbicides only act on grasses, and so on. So make sure you know which kinds of weeds you're dealing with. Sometimes you might identify it down to species, but sometimes, honestly, You might not need to know the species. You might just need to know generally what type of weed it is. Definitely know if it's a grass or a broadleaf, and know if it's a perennial, because perennials can be a lot harder to control with herbicides, and you might need to go for a different method with those. These two links at the bottom are two examples of good resources for identifying weeds. The first link is from University of Minnesota Extension, and it actually has a guide where it asks you questions like, what do the leaves look like? What does the stem look like? And it narrows it down to what weed it will be. And then the Virginia Tech link there shows a lot of good pictures of weeds to help you identify with what you have in your field. Is there a question? Okay. And then the next question is, which products are effective on the weeds present? So once you have determined whether or not the weeds in your field are broadleafs or grasses, there are other tables in the Growing Grapes in Minnesota guide and in the Midwest Fruit Pest Management guide to figure out which products are going to be most effective on the weeds in your field that you're trying to control. So this table shows the effectiveness of various pre-emergent herbicides registered for use in vineyards, and it shows which types of weeds they control. So let's just go through this table real quick. The column on the left lists herbicides, of course, and then the second column and the third column, they have to do with herbicide resistance, which I am going to get to, but in general, they're just telling us relatively what is the risk of herbicide resistance for the products that are listed here. And as I said earlier, there's always potential for resistance developing, but sometimes with certain products, there's a lot more potential than others. And then the next two columns are saying how effective are these products on managing broadleaf weeds versus grasses. And then if we nail down further, annual broadleaves or perennials, annual grasses or perennials. So you can see that with these pre-emergents, most of them have no activity on perennial weeds. That's why we rely on a lot of handwork to get out those perennial weeds from our vineyards. But if we're trying to find something that's effective on both broadleaves and grasses, for instance, let's go to Allion. It says it's effective on most annual broadleaves and most annual grasses. So maybe that's a product that you consider applying if you have a lot of grasses and broadleaves. However, you should then try to learn more about the product before you think about applying it. This is a similar table from the same guide. This lists your some of the post-emergent herbicides that are labeled for vineyards. Similar type table here. Herbicide resistance, the third thing to consider. We've talked about this a little bit. We hear a lot about Roundup resistance, but of course it's not the only type of herbicide resistance. It's just one where we do struggle with it more because there was so much glyphosate being applied and still is from about 1996 onward. So some of the, just for example, some of the glyphosate resistant populations that we have in Minnesota are water hemp, ragweed, giant ragweed, and Palmer amaranth. These are just a few of them, but these are all problematic weeds, and there are populations that are resistant to glyphosate. So if you have some of these weeds in your vineyard, consider using something else because you don't know if maybe the populations in your vineyard are already resistant. How herbicide resistant works is basically if the same herbicide mode of action or family, in other words, is used too much. Basically in each weed population, there might be a certain amount of that population that has genetic resistance to that herbicide mode of action. So if you keep spraying the same product on it over and over again, the resistant individuals in that population are going to survive and they're going to keep flourishing where the susceptible populations die. And so you end up with more and more resistant weeds in the field. And this is especially apparent in cornfields and soybean fields where they're spraying for weeds quite a bit. I've seen huge populations of Palmer amaranth just completely take over fields because they're resistant to just about everything that they're spraying on them. So we want to avoid that. So here are some tips for avoiding herbicide resistance. If you used an herbicide more than about 2 to 3 times last year, let's say for example, you sprayed a lot of Roundup last year, lay off on that the next year and use something different. Use something with a different mode of action. 2, alternate herbicides of different chemical groups, in other words, mode of action between applications. So maybe you applied Roundup in the spring. consider applying something else the next time you go out. Avoid heavy reliance on glyphosate because resistance is so common and there are other products out there that are effective and labeled for vineyards. This is another table in the Growing Grapes in Minnesota guide that talks about herbicide resistance, so this is very helpful. The WSSA codes, this is a Weed Science Society of America. For each mode of action, they've given it a different number. And it tells you here what mode of action or each one has, in other words, how it attacks the plant. And then it gives examples of pre-emergent herbicides that belong to each mode of action. So let's say you applied Matrix at the beginning of the season. The next application, consider applying a different one that has a different mode of action. So Matrix is group 2. So maybe next time you go out, you apply, let's say Chateau, for example, based on what weeds you have in the field. That's a different mode of action, it's 14. So you can use this table to make sure that you are properly rotating between herbicide modes of action. Another thing to consider is wind speed. Herbicide drift, as lots of us know, is a bad problem in vineyards. Lots of the time, herbicide drift is coming from elsewhere, coming from possibly neighboring crop fields. But we can also drift on ourselves if we're not careful. It's not just 2,4-D and dicamba drift that can affect vineyards. Glyphosate drift can also injure vines, and usually we don't see that injury until the next year. It can go into the plant and damage the tissue and cause this type of injury to emerge about a year after application. So what drift is it's movement of herbicides to off-target plants. The droplets can blow in the air or the chemical can vaporize and travel through the air. If the wind speed is too low, this seems counterintuitive, but that can actually cause an inversion effect where the vapors go into a cloud in the air and they travel to a different field or a different part of your field. So that can happen if the wind speed is less than about 3 miles per hour. If the wind speed is over 15 miles per hour, then we get droplets blowing in the air to off-target plants. So watch your wind speed, make sure you're spraying between about 3 and 15 miles per hour as much as possible, or just don't spray. So this is a list of a few of the tools that we can use for deciding what to spray and when. So the Growing Grapes in Minnesota guide, Midwest Fruit Pest Management guide, I have mentioned these a few times. I wrote an article in April of this past year on herbicide recommendations for new vineyard plantings. So you can find that one on our enology page. If you go to the news tab, we have our old blog post there, and you can scroll down and find that in April of last year, or of this year, not 2020 yet. Another good guide that I found is the Cornell Vineyard Weed Management Guide. That's online, of course, and it has a lot of detail about different herbicide options. And then the product labels. Always read the label before you apply something or even before you buy something, because the label is the law and it also gives you a lot of great information. So I'm going to go through, we're going to practice how to actually make a weed management plan, but I think there might be another question.
Why don't you listen to them at the end?
Okay, sounds good. We'll get to the question in a minute. The first step is to identify what weeds are problems in the vineyard. At this point in the year, we can't really go out to the vineyard and see anything. So you're thinking about what weeds were problems this past season, or what weeds do you consistently see in your vineyard? And then identifying those, at least knowing, are they a broadleaf? Are they a grass? Are they perennial or annual? For vineyards, since vineyards are not one of the main crops grown in the US like corn and soybeans, we don't always have a ton of information about which products are best on which specific weeds. We do for some products, but not others. So at least knowing whether it's a summer annual broadleaf, winter annual, etc., that's the bare minimum of what you really want to know. So if I look at this photo, I don't remember where this was taken, but there were a few different weeds growing. If I look up at the top here in the canopy, I happen to know that those are seed heads from mare's tail, also called horseweed. So this is a winter annual broadleaf. That means that it germinates in the fall, it grows a little bit, it overwinters, and then it continues growing in the spring. So it's really important that I know when in the season it's actually germinating. Let's see, if I go down here to the left, down in this little corner of the photo, that is red root pigweed. So that is a type of summer annual broadleaf weed that grows very tall and very fast. It can get up to, I think it's 200,000 seeds per plant. Palmer amaranth is another pigweed that can get up to 1 million seeds per plant. It's really important to control these. If we go over to the bottom right-hand side of the photo, I see a lot of lamb's quarter all under that vine. Lamb's quarter is a very common summer annual broadleaf weed that I'm sure lots of people have seen in their vineyards. All right, so I made up a template table that anybody could use for deciding what products to spray and when. So what I'm doing is I'm going to fill in this table based on how I'm going to best attack the weeds that are in that vineyard. I'm not just creating an arbitrary program. I'm trying to think, what are the main weed problems I have and how am I going to get at those with my weed management program? So a lot of the, let's say, pretend a lot of the major weeds in your vineyard are lamb's quarter, mare's tail, pigweed, and then annual grasses. So all of these were based on what we saw last year in that photo. What I'm going to do is create a table that the left-hand column is time during the season or date, expected weeds that I'm going to see during that time in the season, and then decide what product to spray and what type of product that is. Is it a pre-emergent or a post-emergent? So the first one, I'm gonna think about the weed first and then go into my table. So the first one that I'm going to have to deal with is mare's tail. When does mare's tail germinate? It germinates in the fall, but then it comes back in the spring. So by the time we get out into the vineyard in the spring, it's already growing. If it's already growing, that means that we're going to have to attack it with a post-emergent herbicide and not a pre-emergent herbicide because it's already germinated. So now my job is to figure out which product do I want to be spraying in the spring to attack that mare's tail. So I'm going to go to my Growing Grapes in Minnesota guide. That's where this table is from. And I look at this table of herbicide effectiveness on broadleaves versus grasses. And what I find is that some of these products, AIM, Venue, Gramoxone, Glyphosate, Reglone, and Rely 280, they all say that they are effective on most annual broadleaves. All right, so that's good. Some of them are effective on grasses as well, which can also be nice if you already have some grasses coming up at that point in the season. So that's 6 products at least that I could choose from. Then how do you decide, which product to choose from there? Well, maybe you already have one in your arsenal, but maybe you want to find some other information about these products to make sure it's appropriate. So you can go to the Midwest Fruit Pest Management Guide and learn a lot about these products. So maybe you wanted to spray Rely, but then you go down here and you read more about Rely down at the bottom in your guide, and it says spray only trunks with calloused, mature brown bark and less protected from spray contact by grow tubes or something else. So maybe your vineyard, you just planted it last year, maybe you have a lot of trunks that you're renewing. In that case, maybe Rely isn't the best choice and you might want to pick something else. So that's just an example. Make sure you read up on your product in order to choose an appropriate one. Okay, but in my case, it's a mature vineyard, and I say that the best product options in that particular case, after reading the guide, are Rely 280 and Roundup. All right, again, those are just examples. So then the next step is, let's look at lamb's quarter, grasses, and pigweed. What are we going to do about those? So those are summer annuals, at least lamb's quarter and pigweed are. And summer annuals mean they're going to be germinating in the spring or in the early summer. And so that means that I can spray a pre-emergent in the spring or in the early summer to prevent those from coming up. So what am I going to apply? This is a pre-emergent herbicide table showing effectiveness of these different products. And we can see that there are a lot of products that have some or a lot of effectiveness on broadleaf weeds. So then I have a lot of choices. How am I going to decide? Again, look in the Midwest Fruit Pest Management Guide, read up on these products, see which one would be most effective on your particular vineyard. Let's say in this case, I read up and I decided that Treflan and Carmex were going to be the best products to use on my particular vineyard based on the size of the vines and my particular site. All right, so you can just use this process to fill in that herbicide table. And then, there's a lot of stuff that I wasn't able to get to today, particularly how to determine herbicide rates, what restrictions there are on each product, and how to apply them safely. So first, of course, read the label. The second thing to do is attend a pesticide safety and environmental education workshop. So these are required if you're going to be spraying a restricted use herbicide, but even if you're not, they're still really important to know because they'll go through how to read a label, they'll go through how to properly use personal protective equipment, and lots of other really important things to know before you go out and spray pesticides. So there's one being offered on January 15th in St. Cloud, right before the Minnesota Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association conference, and you can find information about that at this link. This is our final slide, so hopefully we can get to any of those extra questions that were coming up. I saw the little orange box pop up quite a bit. But I wanted to leave these resources here so that if you want to take a screenshot or write down these URLs, you have time to do that. So Matt, maybe we can get to the rest of the questions.
Sure, Annie. Thanks for your presentation. Mark Hart left some nice comments that I'd just like to reiterate, and I think the comments do become available on the final project when those slides get posted, but I guess I don't know. So I'm going to say them now.
I can make them available at least.
So just to really reiterate, you need to read the label every time. You might think that you're spraying the same product because it has the same active ingredient. And the example was Surflan, which has a generic name of Arizolan, that there are different products with different labels. And so you need to read the label on your container and look at the registered EPA number so that you use it appropriately and legally. And then also the comment that soil texture and vine size/age go hand in hand. Like in sandy soils or coarse soils, that pre-emergent herbicides are going, and all herbicides are going to behave differently based on that soil. Yeah. And then a couple of other comments that Mark made, which I thought were really good. We're thinking about when you're reading the labels, some of them have certain lifespan and half-life based on sunlight, that water plays a role, and thinking about that some of them work best when they're integrated into the soil, so that tillage might be required for some of them to work. And think about, for example, if you're mixing with Roundup that relies on contact with the plants and getting absorbed by the plant, that if you also need to apply water to get a secondary product to work, that you need to figure out what your interval is to get both products to be effective. So really think about how you're going to apply your products and how they're being used. So thanks, Mark, again for those comments.
Yeah, thank you, Mark.
So working backwards, there was just a comment that droplet size of your sprayer is important. Yep. Of course, it'd be impossible for Annie or anyone to give this presentation and talk about sprayers and spray nozzles and those things, because that's really pretty specific to each individual. And if you have questions about that, it's always good to talk to your supplier. They have great information about that.
And also, some of the products have regulations on which spray droplet size you can use. So
there was a question about using oils, sticking agents, or what we would maybe call adjuvants,
yes,
to help with effectiveness. I don't remember who made the comment, but just wondering if you could comment on the effectiveness of using those products, because they hadn't before, or maybe someone else could.
Sure. That's another thing where read the label, because a lot of these product labels will talk about which adjuvants they recommend using, or if you should even be using any at all. So it totally depends on the product that you're applying.
You showed an image really early on that was soil pits, and it showed woods in the background. And the question that kind of came up, is that a stock photo of what a soil pit looks like? Or were someone evaluating competition with the woods, between a vineyard and the woods? I'm not sure if you know the answer to that.
I love that question because I'm in that photo.
Okay.
I'm going to go back to it now. The only reason I use that photo is because I couldn't find a photo of the pits that we dug in vineyards. But for my master's, we were digging pits in vineyards, and there were other studies that did that as well. But that pit is just an unfortunate instance where I also had to stand in pits in forests before I started my project. So that's me and my brother looking in the pit. Yep.
All right. A few more questions popped up.
Okay.
So thanks for talking about controlling under the canopy, but what about managing weeds between rows? When can we spray, and what can we spray to control those weeds in the grasses?
Matt might have a good answer on that, having some background in turf grass. But typically, a lot of people don't really worry too much about managing the weeds between the rows because that's just something that we're mowing regularly. But if you're trying to, let's say, maybe you're getting a lot of crabgrass or something, then you're going to need to find a product that's effective on crabgrass that's still labeled for vineyards.
Right. And yeah, for crabgrass, that's usually pre-emergent control, getting those seeds before they germinate, which is pretty early spring. If you have perennial weed problems, like Canada thistle, someone just had it. How do you control Canada thistle? Is there a good program? A hoe and a shovel work pretty well. Timing is important. Thinking about controlling broadleaf weeds in your grass, which is what most people have between the rows. Products like 2,4-D are not a good option in most vineyards unless your timing is good. So I think that'd probably be a case-by-case basis to really think about what the objective is. Mowing and repeated mowings are great ways to control broadleaf weeds in most situations, unless they're these noxious weeds like Canada thistle.
In Canada thistle, good time to control that one is in the fall. Because what's happening with thistle in the fall, and I've given an entire hour-long presentation on thistle, so just very quick comment, not the whole story. But in the fall, thistles are taking all of their carbohydrates from the leaves and they're trying to put them underground because it's a perennial. So if you spray, let's say Roundup on a thistle in the fall, it will allocate that Roundup down to the roots. And so it does a better job of controlling it if you do it in the fall versus in the summer when it's really small and actively growing, which is kind of counterintuitive.
One last question that I see, you're welcome to type more. I know Annie has a meeting in a few minutes, but oh, good, another one popped up. Okay, are there any implications that herbicide use on bare soil or having a mowed grown understory have on spore transmission? I've heard it mentioned that bare soil can increase fungal transmission, but I'm not sure where that information comes from. Just generically, it seems like depends on what types of spores. Most of the spores that we're concerned with in the vineyard overwinter on grape tissue, not necessarily on the soil itself. And so the overwintering structures are either on mummied berries themselves that have fallen off, on leaf tissue, on pruning wood and so forth that overwinter on the soil there. And so it's not the soil per se. So I guess I'm not really sure how having any difference between having it mowed or on bare soil makes a difference at the moment. I could probably come up with a better answer than that.
We could do some looking too, if I know who asked the question, because Wayne Wilcox at Cornell might have looked into that. I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's always a good management practice to get any of those tissues out of your vineyard. Other management practices, even like sometimes mowing and mulching tissue that comes off of your orchard or vineyard, can help disrupt that tissue, help it break down faster in the fall, prevent those spores from the tissue from growing and germinating, and spores from being released in the spring. All right, there's one more question. What about the overall effect of harboring fungal spores in an overly weedy vineyard?
Anecdotally, I do know of one organic orchard that was trying to let their grass grow every year, and then they recently decided to mow it regularly instead because they were finding a lot of disease just kind of hanging out in that grass. And they found that once they started mowing it more, they had less disease incidents.
Insect pests too are something to consider. There's plenty of insect pests and beneficial insects that hang out under your vines and in your vines. And so depending on what you're trying to accomplish, what plant materials are there, the height, time of mowing, and herbicide application may impact them. One question I overlooked, I apologize, I wrote it down and then I skipped over it. It is on the topic of sheep. Are there any good resources of what is safe to spray that won't hurt them?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't have the answer to that. If you're going the sheep route, you'll probably be working with a farmer who has sheep and is bringing them out to your vineyard to graze. And so my hope is that they would have some of that information. But if you call one of the livestock people at University of Minnesota Extension, or if you're in another state, Iowa State Extension, the livestock extension team there will have an answer to that question, or they'll be able to find it. So I would contact your local extension about that.
All right, Annie, I don't see any other questions. So thank you for hosting today. Thanks everyone for joining in. We do plan to have a few more presentations this winter in the webinar format that hopefully you will help spread the word and join in. If you have further questions, you're always able to reach out to Annie, to myself, and we can try to get you the right information and provide you connections with people if we don't have that information to help you improve your vineyard practices. So thanks again for everybody, and thanks to Annie for putting this on.
Sure. Thanks, Matt. Everybody have a good day.